Hello and welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, pastor of Miller Avenue Baptist Church in Mill Valley, California. That's Marin County, right next to San Francisco. And here we are. We're going through the Gospel of Mark. We are in chapter 14, nearing the end. And we have two different pieces we're going to look at in this program. One is titled The Betrayal and Arrest of Jesus. The other is A Young Man Flees. Two rather short pieces. And at the end, if I have any time left, who knows what might happen. But, you know, the names of these little sections are given. They're not in the original copies. Going back into the 2nd century, in the documents that we have, and by the way, there's between about 6,500 and 7,000 manuscripts of the New Testament, and some are really good, some are not so good, but we started putting titles in the sections which aren't original. For example, the first one here in Mark chapter 14, verse 43, talks about the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. That comes from the editors of this particular version. And so we know it's not in the original. All right, let's get started. This is now very close to the end of Jesus' ministry. He's going to be dead in less than a day. Actually, he's going to be dead at this particular point in just a few hours. So this is how significant this is, taking a look at this end piece. So where we begin in Mark 14:43, it's early morning, would have been Friday morning, still it's dark, and Judas, one of the 12, the only one of Jesus' 12 disciples that were not from Galilee. He was from Judea, down where Jerusalem is. Very interesting. How is it that he became an apostle? And he was the treasurer of the group. He kept the money and he stole from it, and Jesus and the others knew of it. And it's always been a mystery to me why that went on, but it did. So Judas, and we are not exactly clear about all of this, he betrays Jesus. He's going to have Jesus arrested and hopefully killed. We don't know why. Some have said, well, Judas knew who Jesus was. He saw Jesus raise at least 3 from the dead, cast out demons, heal people right and left. He had to know something about who Jesus was. Some have said, well, he's trying to make Jesus reveal his hand and establish the kingdom of God under the Messiah. Others say he was deceived by satanic powers. Some say he was mad at Jesus. We don't really know what Judas's motives were. Here we go. Early in the morning, Friday morning, verse 43, it says, and immediately while he was still speaking, that's why when Jesus was still speaking, they're there with just 3 of the disciples, Peter, James, and John. And there Jesus is. He's gone off. He's had some prayer. And right in the midst of this, Judas shows up. One of the 12s. Remember the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus chose 12 followers. Were called apostles, meaning they would be sent. They would be sent out. So that's what is the 12. The reason why Jesus did that, because of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's We don't find that actually spelled out in Scripture, but that's what is assumed. It says, and with him, with Judas, a crowd, probably armed temple officials that were employed by Jewish leaders, a crowd with swords and clubs, and then it says from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now these are the big shots. They would have been members of what would called the Sanhedrin, a council of 70 ruled over by the high priest. So 71 people. And they were the chief priests. They would have been belonged to the party of the Sadducees. The Sadducees, they were the priests in the temple. In terms of Bible, Hebrew Bible, they only accepted the first 5 books of the Bible, and not the poetry, not the prophetic books at all. They ignored them. They did not believe in a resurrection, and they were opposed to the Pharisees and other religious groups. The Pharisees, there were about 3,000 of them in that particular era, it is estimated. Paul the Apostle was a Pharisee. They organized and ruled in the synagogues, the local meeting places. And they believed in, as accurate, all of the books that we find in what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And the scribes would primarily have been from there. They were the legal experts. In the Greek, it's grammaton, is the word grammaton, scribes. And then the elders. The word elders in the Greek here is presbyters. Presbyters. They were more of a mixed group, but also involved in the synagogue. Verse 44. Now the betrayer, that's of course Judas. Now the betrayer had given them a sign saying, because it's dark, you understand, still dark, given them a sign saying, the one I kiss is the man, seize him and lead him away under guard, or lead him away safely. So now Judas, he has agreed, paying him 30 pieces of silver, not much. And again, we don't know what Judas's motive was for this. Some have said, well, he knew who Jesus was and that Jesus would overcome them. Others said, no, he was angry at Jesus for whatever reasons. For whatever reasons. We don't know exactly. So, giving him a sign, the one I will kiss is the man, seize him. So, we get the idea that Jesus didn't look much different than the rest of them. I don't know if you've ever heard about the Shroud of Turin, but it's an incredible thing. Look it up in the internet, Shroud of Turin, and you'll get an idea of what Jesus looked like. But there he is. He was a regular-looking guy, and so the identification there in the dark was, I'm going to kiss him. That was a common practice. It was a way of greeting. It was like a little hug. It's like a handshake. Seize him and lead him away. Take him away under guard. Verse 45. And when he came, that's Judas, he went up to him. Here's Jesus and Peter, James, and John. He came up to him at once and said, Rabbi. And he kissed him. This was a common way that rabbis would be greeted. In Matthew's account of this, instead of just rabbi, it's, hello, Rabbi. Okay. So, verse 46, and they laid hands on him and seized him. Oh, by the way, after the resurrection, Jesus would no longer be called rabbi by either his followers or others, but the term would be Lord instead. And Lord has a rich, rich meaning to it. It has to do with, you wouldn't call just anybody Lord. but it had to do with recognizing there's something of deity here. There's a godliness here. Lord, and that was the term Jesus would refer to. It would a synonym could be king, but it was a word of high honor. So, so Judas comes up and kissed him, and at once the people that have the clubs and the swords laid hands on Jesus and seized him. Now it says, but one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Who was that? Well, Mark, the author of our gospel here, this was the first gospel. He was a young man, maybe a teenager yet, at the time of this event. And it was a period, some say Mark was written as early as 49 or the early 50s. It's really very difficult to know. But we know who pulled out a sword. There was two of the disciples that had swords. Very likely Simon the Zealot. He was a rebel. It's figured that he had one, but then there was a second sword, and apparently Peter had it. He had it. This was his sword. He drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. In John's Gospel, in chapter 18, verse 10, we find it was Peter. It was Peter. And also, from John's Gospel, we know the name of the servant of the high priest. His name was Malchus, Malchus. So we knew who drew the sword and who got hit. It was Malchus, and it was Peter. It's very interesting. Peter was a wild character. He was a leader type for sure. However, he was a little bit strange, and you'll be finding that out soon. Probably, I think we're going to be touching on that in the very next program. So anyway, he drew his sword and he cut off the ear. So that's what we're looking at here. By the way, in the other gospel, we find that Jesus right then heals the man with the ear. Now he cut off his ear. That means Jesus had to have gotten down on the ground, stooped down, or maybe on his knees, found the ear and healed him. We find that. Here's the last major healing that Jesus has done. He's healed, very likely, the estimate could run into the hundreds. It could run into the thousands. And here was the last healing miracle of Jesus. This guy's ear. It's very difficult to picture that. I've tried to envision it myself. What that might have looked at there with the torches to light up the place, the soldiers with the swords and the clubs, and Jesus nevertheless heals them. Why Mark doesn't say this, doesn't tell us, there's been several ideas advanced, but primarily it was to protect. It was to protect. Perhaps protect Peter, perhaps protect Malchus, who had his ear cut off. But there are various ideas given, and nobody's ever going to really know for sure, this side of heaven anyway. And so that's what's happened. So Jesus heals the man. Verse 48. And Jesus said to them, I sort of picture this. Jesus picks up the ear, puts it on a man's head, and then he begins to talk. They are amazed. They're stunned. They're struck. they're just struck that Jesus would do this. And it says, verse 48, Jesus said to them, have you come out as against a robber? Now the word robber can also be translated rebel, a rebel. And it says, have you? Now, it's a question that Jesus asked them. Amazing, isn't it? I've tried to get a little bit into the mindset. Of course, it's impossible for somebody like me to gain that kind of understanding. You just sort of guess a little bit what was happening here. Perhaps he's trying to quiet things down. He doesn't want any more violence. He just wants to settle down. Okay, he knows why they're there. And he says, have you come out against a robber? A robber. In other words, he's not acting like that. Jesus is not resisting. You have to picture this. Yeah, Peter resisted, pulling out the sword. But the reality is, Jesus made no attempt to resist. He wouldn't have gotten very far. Well, all the miracles that he did, I suppose he could have easily walked away. He easily walked away. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have this situation where the guy's healed, because we're looking at Jesus, who raised the dead, at least 3 people, cast out demons, walked on water, fed 5,000 with a little bit, and 4,000 a second time with a little bit. Here it is, the miracle man. The miracle man. He could have walked away. He could have flattened the ball. But he didn't. He didn't. So he says, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? One of my favorite commentators, or the material on what the passages mean, William Hendrickson. He died some years ago. Simon Kistemaker has taken over for him. And if you ever want to get good commentaries, that would be by William Hendrickson and Simon Kistemaker, although I deal with many points of their theology. Of course, no 2 Christians agree on everything, which is good. But anyway, William Hendrickson says is Jesus spoken in a calm and earnest manner. Very insightful. He wasn't yelling at him. He wasn't angry. But he just spoken in a calm and earnest manner. Whether or not that's exactly it, but I will go along with Hendrickson that that's how it was. He says to the people, he says, day after day, I was with you in the temple teaching. I mean, he was available all the time. For that last week, he spent almost every day, as far as we can see, in the temple, and he was teaching. Readily apprehendable. Could have got him easy. Day after day, I was with you. That's a plural you. All of those people, I was with you in the temple teaching. I love the idea of he was in the temple teaching. Jesus is a teacher. Yeah, he healed, did the miracles, but his primary work was teaching. He wanted to communicate to his disciples the realities that have their beginning in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. But that's what he primarily did. Jesus was a teacher. Yeah, he was a healer. Yeah, he's going to save us through his death, burial, and resurrection. But he's a teacher. And that's why I love to do what's called Bible expository preaching. For many years, I used to wake up on Sunday morning to get a message that that I wanted to preach on Sunday morning, and I did that for probably about 2/5 of my ministry, when I all of a sudden changed over and said, I want to be a teacher too. I want to be like Jesus. I want to teach people His Word. And that's why we do this television program as well. That's a part of it. Straightforward teaching. You're not hearing a sermon. You're not hearing a topical sermon. You're hearing Bible expository teaching. And to me, it is exactly what Jesus did. Of course, nobody could do it like Jesus. He says, and you did not seize me. He was there all the time. He didn't seize him there. I don't know why Jesus said that. And the commentators aren't able to come up with an explanation of why Jesus talked like that too. But that's what He said. And you did not seize me. Probably because it would have been unsafe with all the people around. It would have not looked good for the power people to have subdued Jesus and dragged Him out of the temple. They wanted to do it in this way. Of course, it was perfect. So we understand. But He says this. To chide them? I don't know. Maybe to bring to their awareness what was going on. Anyway, you did not seize me. Then He says, but let the Scriptures be fulfilled. So many. You have heard me say before, we wouldn't need a New Testament to know all of this. It's all there in the Hebrew Bible, written for a long time, and the last parts of it were written about 500 years before the birth of Jesus. Our Hebrew Bible, Genesis to the end, Malachi. And so they had all that, and within that, everything that was needed to be known about the Messiah, the one God sent to save, was all present. All present. Okay. Before I go to this last little bit, I want to make sure we know that as Jesus is led away, Peter and John followed them. We find that out in John 18, verse 15. Okay, so the next part, the last 3 verses are Mark chapter 15, verse 51 to 52. It's titled, A Young Man Flees. It's only in Mark's gospel because he's the young man who flees. Somehow, Mark is aware they had just had the Last Supper, before at the house, and it was likely Mark's house. He was a young man, teenager likely. And it's only here in the Gospel of Mark. So here we have it, and he doesn't mention who he is, likely out of modesty. He did not include his own name, perhaps even to protect his family. It was probably Mark's mother who had invited Jesus and the disciples to the Last Supper in her house there in Jerusalem in the upper room. Speculation. We don't know this for sure. All right, verse 51 to 52, 2 verses. It says, and a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. Basically, that would have been his pajamas. His pajamas. Well, they didn't use that term, of course, but a linen cloth. And because the linen cloth, he was from a family of some wealth, because that was an expensive piece, and most people didn't have a linen cloth to use as pajamas. Okay. A linen cloth about his body. And they seized him. So they saw this young kid, saw him. They wouldn't have known who he was, but of course he wasn't with them. And he hadn't originally been with Jesus. And it says, and they seized him. They grabbed a hold of him. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. This has got to be Mark, the author of this gospel. So that's part of it. I don't really have time to go into these passages in the Gospels that I was going to use to show that the Gospel writers, Matthew, Paul, and Peter, three of the Gospel writers, paid attention that those people, the Christians that follow Jesus, they were to pay respect to the governing authorities. Matthew says, people come up to him and said, are we supposed to pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus said, give me a coin. And he gave me a coin. And he says, whose picture's on the coin? It was Caesar's. He says, pay to Caesar what is belonged to Caesar, and to God's what belongs to God. So Jesus was not going to turn Jewish people against the Romans. And then Paul in Romans 13 talks about giving submission to the authorities. And it's very clear that he's speaking to the Roman authorities. If you obeyed the Roman authorities, if you paid the taxes, and you weren't rebels against them, you're okay. What happened later on, though, it got bad, and we find people today rebelling against political leaders. And then Peter says pretty much the same thing, that we are to obey our leaders, that we are to obey the Lord, and this is found in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 to 17. Okay. In other words, all political leaders are not there to damage us, but to protect, and we're to observe that power. So that's the way it is. Things have changed. We have dictators wielding the sword in an awful manner all over the world, all the way from the time of Jesus. But we do not rebel and fight against, neither we submit. Our submission is to our Lord Jesus Christ. So long.